I have to say that as a teacher, trying to navigate the topic of belief, the existence or non-existence of mythical beings, reality versus pretend, can be an absolute minefield. One of the strangest responsibilities that you pick up as an adult, and one that people do not often talk about, is the duty to slowly erase the magic from the world. As kids get older, it's necessary, slowly, to tell them that the world is far colder and less imbued with mystery than they believed, or as we led them to believe. For the first few years of their lives, we allow children to live with the idea that the world is mystical, that the impossible can come to pass, and that the things we can see and touch do not represent the limits of what can exist. We invite and encourage them to believe in a world populated by fantastic characters and figures that occupy some realm beyond the visible. We answer questions about Father Christmas, the Tooth Fairy, and the Easter Bunny, and lie to the children's faces, confirming myths and fantasies and labeling them as truths. We encourage them to believe, just so we can then tell them not to believe a few years later. The problem is, some parents think it is the teacher's responsibility to make this stuff clear to the kids, whilst others absolutely do not. Whilst it is your responsibility to educate your pupils, to give them accurate information and to tell them as much as possible, the truth, when it comes to the topic of invisible characters, goes out the window. I have seen parents almost come to blows with teachers over the topic of Santa Claus because the teacher gave a hint to a class full of 12-year-olds that old St. Nick might be made up and the parents hadn't dropped that bombshell yet. The same goes for the Tooth Fairy. I have personally witnessed a child in tears with a conspicuously missing front tooth standing behind a parent as she screamed at the teacher, insisting not only that the Tooth Fairy was real, but that she would be visiting their home that very night. What is doubly ironic about this situation is the fact that mythical figures seem to have shelf life based upon good behavior. For example, Santa and the Tooth Fairy are allowed to stay on as truth well into the early teens of some kids because they are nice and friendly. Monsters, ghosts, and other horrible creatures are consigned to the scrap heap, with the very same parents telling their children that it's silly and ridiculous of them to think that such things can exist. If a teacher dares suggest that ghosts or ghoulies might exist, or even leaves the door open for such a possibility, they run the risk of again landing in trouble for terrifying the kids. Somehow, the thought of a tiny creature slipping into their bedroom to steal their teeth is fine, but the idea that someone might once have seen a ghost is anti-scientific nonsense that might traumatize a child. Like I said, it can be a minefield. This is made all the more difficult by the fact that kids seem to want to hold on to some of the nastier fantasy creatures. They have an almost sixth sense for the creepy and weird, an instinct for monsters that they are reluctant to get rid of. In every school I've ever worked at, there has been at least one ghost or bogeyman that every successive generation of kids knew about and was afraid of. They would happily spread stories about this figure and scare each other half senseless with tales of what happened to a friend of a friend. At the last school I taught at, that figure was Knocking John. The first time that I, as a teacher, heard of Knocking John was when I asked my English class to do a project of folklore and myth. A group of students asked if they could do their presentation on a local myth and gave a presentation about this local bogeyman. According to them, Knocking John was either a student who had been bricked up in the walls of the school when it was built, a caretaker who had died after being locked inside the boiler room over the holidays, where he slowly starved to death, or a creature that fed on children, which had made its home in the dark spaces around the school, waiting for an opportunity to slip out of the shadows and take one. He was variously said to live in the space beneath the main stairs, behind the stage in the main assembly room hall, in the caretaker's boiler room, which again were downstairs, just around the back of the playground, or in the kit room of the PE area, where he would lurk in the dark behind the collections of balls and the stacks of old gym mats. The students, in what I have to say was a well-researched presentation, recounted a number of supposedly first-hand accounts of encounters with this creature that knocked on the walls, the pipes or the desks, in an attempt to lure the pupils closer, to be devoured. During a 20-minute presentation, they referenced interviews they had conducted with old people from the local village who had attended the same school, and even some of the current staff members. They presented a number of stories, which varied in detail, but in which this Knocking John character always lived at the school and always had hands with fingers that stretched to a ridiculously unnatural length. These long, thin digits, like the willowy branches of a tree, they said, were used to knock on the surfaces, but also to stretch out toward the child, to snatch them up and take them away. I gave the presentation an A for delivery and another A for the level of research. The kids seemed happy, and I was genuinely interested to hear about this piece of local myth. That, I thought, would be the end of it. But it wasn't. The following day, I was called into the head's office where two cross-looking parents were already sitting. During the course of the next half hour, I was told off for allowing my pupils to talk about and research such terrifying things. Apparently after school that day, the drama department, preparing for the school production of Romeo and Juliet, had been rehearsing in the main hall and had decided to dig out some of the old costumes that were stored under the stage itself. The stage, made completely of wood, was hollow, allowing a trapdoor toward the back to be taken up, and for things like props, extra chairs, and in this case, decades-old costumes, to be stored in the empty space below that stretched for several tens of meters all the way from the backstage area to the front of the stage. The below stage area was only around 4 feet high and only opened once every few years. It had no lighting, so anyone going in there via the trapdoor would need to take a torch down with them if they hoped to actually see anything. On this occasion, a young lad named Mark had volunteered. Apparently it was always the case that a student would be sent down to investigate rather than a staff member, just because of how much of a tight squeeze it was down there. Mark, whom I taught English to and who had been there for the presentations earlier that day, had wriggled through the trapdoor and down under the stage, armed with a small torch. He had gone in there willingly and with a big smile on his face, until, after having disappeared for a few moments, the others standing above began to hear knocking, 3 sharp raps on the underside of the stage, as if someone below was hammering on the boards so that those above would hear it. Knock, knock, knock. The entire place went silent as all of the students stopped and looked at each other. A few tried nervous smiles, convinced that it was Mark messing about, until the knocks came again. Knock, knock, knock. This time, they were followed by a scream. There was then the sounds of thudding as Mark thrashed and crawled desperately in an attempt to get out. His torch had gone out, and unable to see, he had not been able to find the trapdoor through which he had entered, and instead banged furiously on the underside of the stage, like someone trapped below the surface of a sheet of ice, desperately trying to find the breathing hole. Eventually he was pulled out, but by the time he came out terrified, jabbering senselessly about something in the corner with a melted face and fingers, just long, thin fingers. Mark had been taken home, and had been too unwell to come to school the following day, because he had been up all night long, raving about someone called Knocking John. Whilst the drama department took most of the blame, I was apparently also in the wrong for putting the idea in his head in the first place, despite the fact that it was the students who had raised the issue, and I had made no such suggestion. Either way, his parents were furious. I was given a solid dressing down from the head and told to be more careful about the content of my lessons. Leaving his office that morning, I have to say that I felt more than a little annoyed. I liked Mark. He was a good student, and up until that point we'd had a good relationship. As such, I was cheesed off that his parents were now painting me as public enemy number 1, because his classmates happened to tell some hokey old ghost story in my lesson. Mark returned to school a week later and never mentioned the incident. He also never went back to the drama production and refused to go near the stage. His part had to be taken over by another student, and again I was blamed for the inconvenience to the drama department. So it was that a month later, when the production actually went ahead in front of a full assembly hall filled with parents and a large number of students, I felt more than a little resentful. What happened after the show, however, left me feeling both vindicated and, like everyone, deeply creeped out. The students had finished the play, had done their bows, and received their praise, and were actually coming through to meet their parents, as everyone began to slowly shuffle out of the place and off to the rest of their evening, when a sound suddenly echoed around the hall. It was the sound of knocking, coming from under the stage. At first, people continued to bustle and chat, and the sound was barely noticed, but as it grew louder and more insistent, people fell into a hush, every eye in the place fixed upon the stage, the curtains now closed. Again the knocking came. Knock, knock, knock. Loud, clear, and undeniable. I watched as people exchanged furtive glances. They had all heard the sound just as they'd heard the story of what happened to Mark and the tales of Knocking John back when they were at school. The sound came again. Knock, knock, knock. Crystal clear, like a clarion call on a frosty morning. Sharp, hard, and undeniable, or so I thought. As I watched, the parents began to turn their children toward the door, ignoring the sound as if it had never happened. No one spoke, and if any child did happen to point or ask who was knocking or suggest that someone might be under there, they were promptly hushed and shooed out of the door. None of the parents ever said a word about the knocking. It was as if, somehow, they had silently agreed that if nobody mentioned it, then perhaps it didn't happen. As I, in turn, walked toward the door, I locked eyes with Mark's parents, The same pair that had complained about me filling their child's head with make-believe. They both looked terrified as they walked away, in silence. Like everyone else in that hall, they had seen the reality, and like everyone else, they had chosen to play pretend.